Greetings from Salford and Manchester. We're happy to welcome you all to another talk, and we're very happy to have here today Maria Bloshteyn, who's in Toronto. So good morning to you in Toronto, Maria. And the topic is the anthology of poetry, which Maria has recently edited and which is about to be published by Smokestack Books. That is called Russia is Burning, Poems of the Great Patriotic War. And as I always say, our events are free. If you feel able to donate to the library, there is a donate button on our website and we'd be delighted to hear from you. For the moment, however, what I will do is hand over to Maria and start the first slide. Okay.
All right. So, Lynette, thank you very much. I am the editor of Russia is Burning, as you said. I just received the books yesterday, so it's all still extremely exciting and very fresh. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk about the book. Now, the book's main claim to fame, other than its size, I don't know how that happened, is the fact that it includes voices of poets that were left out, both of Soviet anthologies of poetry of World War II and post-Soviet anthologies. So we're talking about Gulag poets, dissident poets, émigré poets, and others. The reasons why these poets were left out was something that maybe we can discuss during question and answer. But what I'd like to do now is to tell you a bit about my connection to both the war and the writing of the anthology, or the putting together of the anthology, because it's a bit of a strange combination. You know, how does someone living in Toronto get to do an anthology like this with an independent press in England? So I'll tell you a little bit about how the anthology came about. And then I want to share some poems with you, because after all, that's the most exciting part. That's why the anthology is here. So if you could go to the next slide, Lynette. So as you all know, Russia, the Soviet Union, I should say, lost many more dead in the war than any other country. The number right now, the official number, is 27 million. During Stalin's time, it was 7 million. Then Khrushchev upped it to 20 million. 27 million is the number that came about during Glasnost and Perestroika. Right now, they're saying, I've heard that according to some documents that have been discovered, it's closer to 42 million. But 27 million is the official number to date. And I can tell you that not a single family living right now in the former Soviet Union has gone unaffected by the war. Next slide, please. My own connection to the war is through my two grandfathers, who both fought. My maternal grandfather fought on the Leningrad front. My paternal grandfather fought on the Baltic front. But I hardly knew both of them. So my main connection to the war is through my father, the young man you see with a cigarette in the photograph, wartime photograph over here. He was trying to enlist as soon as the war broke out, but he was really too young. His father went to fight and he couldn't. As soon as he could join, he did. And within a couple of months, he was on the Kalinin front defending Moscow. So within a couple of months, he was wounded by shrapnel. And then sepsis set in, and he wasn't expected to make it because antibiotics were not widely used yet. They're not available. So he somehow managed to pull through. His entire life, he was affected by what he went through during the war. The last 10 years of his life, he was quite ill. It was all hospitals and specialists and so on and so forth. So what you see on the slide is my father and three young men who are also wounded. They're recuperating in a military sanatorium in Pyatigorsk in 1944. And it says in my dad's handwriting, this is to remember Pyatigorsk, the Marshak mountain, and the Podkuluk River, April 1944, and there's a line and it says, there are four of us, I'm the only one left. So the other three men didn't make it through the war. My father, unfortunately, fortunately he did. Unfortunately, his health was affected for life. It's quite a miracle, a medical miracle, that he managed to live for as long as he had. He died in 1998. And I can tell you that throughout my childhood and my adulthood, my early adulthood, I was very aware of the war. My father never really talked about the war, but he didn't have to. Every time we go to a medical specialist, my mother's introductory phrase would be, my husband was wounded during the war, and that's how it would all start. And when we left the Soviet Union in 1979, we took our library, which contained a lot of, many anthologies of war poetry and many war poets. And I can tell you that every family celebration that we'd have, there would be records of, we'd be playing Mark Bernes, who was one of the singers of war songs, or, you know, there would always be something connecting us to the war. Next slide, please. So I felt that I knew the area, the entire field of war poetry quite well. After all, I grew up with it. And I just want to fast forward to 2014. In 2014, I was very fortunate to have the front seat to observe a rather extraordinary anthology being made. It's this anthology right here. I hope you can all see it. It's the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry. And it was put together by Robert Chandler, Boris Pasternak, and Irina Mashinsky. And as I said, I was very fortunate to see how this book was being put together. So it was not only master classes of translation, because I would see how they worked on every single poem. There'd be all these variations, and everyone would be something that looked perfectly fine to me. There would be all these, insights and variations and subtleties to come up with really some wonderful translations. But also this anthology was very inspiring to me because it broke rules. It didn't follow the beaten track. And yet it has really managed to present a very full, expansive, and unusual view of Russian poetry. I highly recommend it to anyone who likes Russian poetry, who likes Russian poetry in general. It's a very, very good anthology. I think the best around right now. And anyhow, while I was appreciating all of this, this extraordinary man, Andy Croft, who is a poet and a writer and a biographer and a scholar, and also the force behind Smokestack Books in England. Smokestack Books publishes radical poetry and very, very unusual volumes. He reached out to Robert Chandler, and he asked him if Robert would like to translate a selection of Soviet World War II poems. Robert had many projects on the go at that time. And so he asked me whether I would be interested, if I would be willing to do something like that. And of course, I felt that, yes, this is a perfect project for me. I know the field inside out. I'll select some interesting poems, we'll put together, and that'll be that. So, but all kinds of things happened in the meantime, and I had to put it off and off. And poor Andy Croft he said, it's okay, just take your time, whenever you're ready. And he originally wanted this selection of poems to be available for the 70th anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany. So that was 5 years ago. And anyhow, so things were put off, and I started to do the research. And as I was doing the research, and I was going through the anthologies that both we brought from the Soviet Union and the new anthologies that came out since the Soviet Union fell, I realized that there are all these voices missing. And very gradually dawned upon me that what I thought was a really good knowledge of the field was really I just knew the tip of the iceberg. And I started trying, well, when I had this epiphany, I started thinking, what is it that really should be done for this? Because this is more, I'm going to do more than a selection of, Soviet poems. There's really all these voices that need to be heard and all these poems that need to be at least represented somehow. And before I knew it, the project kind of grew and grew and grew. And I said, I really want to do something quite different. And it's going to be a large anthology. And I'm going to I was thinking about my dad. I was thinking, how can I organize it to make sense? And so I divided it into 3 sections. The first section I ended up calling Voices Heard. And those were the poems and the songs that my father, as a young man fighting on the front, would listen to or would hear. So it would be both, the greatest hits, the Soviet greatest hits, but also the poems and the songs that were not published, but were very well known. And I'll give you an example of that later on. And then for the second section, I called it Muted Voices. And it was all these poems that my father wouldn't be able to hear, but they were about the war. So these were the émigré poets and the dissident poets and poets who were writing for the table, who knew they wouldn't be able to publish their poetry, but they're still writing it and hiding it, putting it aside until different times. And anyhow, so there's this section, and then there's going to be a third section, Remembering the War, and that would be a very inclusive, also inclusive collection of poetry, and it would have both émigré poets and poets writing after the war, and contemporary poets right now writing about their family's experience of the war. And so I came with all of this to Andy Croft, and any sensible person would run. Any sensible person would say, this is not what I had in mind. This is a behemoth. Maybe find someone else. But I think Andy has the same insane streak that I do. So he said, fabulous, do it. And it took me about 5 years, on and off, of working on the anthology and looking for the poems and translating the poems. I should say that I translated many of the poems, but definitely not all of them. The anthology really benefited from many poems, amazing translations of poems, Russian poems that already exist. I should specifically mention James Womack's Tvardovsky, which just came out with Smokestack Books. We have, my anthology has one of his Turkin poems, which is excellent and really highly recommended. I also included some of Simonov's translation by Mike Munford. Simonov is the most famous poet probably to come out of the war, and Mike has done a beautiful job translating his poetry. It's also going to come out in Smokestack Books, I think in about a month. So, and also I asked some poets and some translators to translate poems specifically for the anthology. I can mention Brian Karetnik, who actually found some really interesting émigré poets and translated several poems, for which I'm very grateful. Yvonne Green, who's a poet also living in England, translated a section out of a great poem by Semyon Lipkin. So this anthology really benefited from the work of many, many translators. I can also tell you that my own translations were improved, endlessly improved by Robert Chandler and Irina Mashinsky and Boris Dreluk. I was very, very fortunate that I could endlessly bounce things off of them over 5 years, and they're always very generous with their advice and just very patient and very helpful. So could we have the next slide, please? So let's launch right into the poems. The first two poems that I'm going to share with you are from the first section, Voices Heard. So one of them, this is the first one. It's by Samuel Marshak. I'm going to read, I should tell you that I really tried when I was preparing the anthology to provide as much context for these poems as I could. There is an essay in the back which gives you some historical information, some cultural information, some context for the entire canon of war poetry and how it developed and what it included and what it excluded. But also, every poem has annotations at the top in English, both on the Russian side. It is a bilingual anthology after all, and on the English side. So I'm just going to read what I have from Marshak. I'll also, this is the only poem that I'm going to read in Russian to you because it's blessedly short, but I figure, some Russian must enter into this because it's a bilingual anthology. So Marshak was a talented lyrical poet who debuted back in 1907. He was encouraged by the critic Vladimir Stasov and Maxim Gorky. His national fame, however, rested in his children's poems and later in his extraordinary translations of Shakespeare's sonnets. Marshak was one of the most published and respected poets during the war. And during the war, he wrote poetry, he wrote plays, but he also became famous for his satirical poems. He wrote short poems and captions for war posters and caricatures. often working directly with the artists. And he received the State Stalin Prize for this work in 1942. His poems were very popular both at the front and at the home front. And just before I read the poem in Russian, I should tell you that this poem is dated 27th of April, 1945. On the 26th of April, in Pravda, there was just a little teensy note that, somewhere in Berlin, there are these slogans painted on the walls that, the year 1918 won't be repeated. And then it was crossed out, and exactly what it says here. It was written in Russian, "I'm in Berlin," and signed, Sidorov. So he made it into this little poem that was published in Pravda on the next day, called a Berlin epigram. And I'll read to you in Russian. Берлинская эпиграмма. Год 18 не повторится ныне, кричат со стен слова фашистских лидеров. А сверху надпись мелом «Я в Берлине». И надпись выразительная «Сидоров». So I'll read to you in English now. We shan't relive the year 1918. Up in the walls, the Nazi slogans scoff. And over them in chalk, I'm in Berlin. Signed simply and concisely, Sidorov. So there is an example of Marshak's satirical verse that was very, very popular during the war. Could we please go to the next slide? Thanks. So this is something quite different. This is a poem that was very well known, but was never published during the war. Ian Diggin was a legendary Soviet tank commander, I'm reading from the annotations now, who later became a pioneering orthopedic surgeon. He wrote fierce, unblinking poems about the brutal reality of ground fighting. His poems were not published, but they traveled the fronts anonymously as part of an official canon of wartime poems and songs. Although this poem was famous, no one knew the identity of the author. Vasily Grossman referred to the poem in Life and Fate as being written by a lieutenant killed in the fighting. He included it in the novel. Later, the poem was condemned for its supposed depiction of marauding among Soviet troops, which is not what it's about, obviously. I'll read it to you. My comrade, in your final agony, don't bother calling to friends. Better that your steaming blood should warm my freezing hands. Don't cry and moan, you're not a child. You're not wounded, you're merely shot dead. I'll take your boots to remember you by. There's still lots of fighting ahead. So this is an example of the poem that my father might have heard, but never seen in print during the war. Could we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so now we move on to the second section, which is really the most controversial section of the book, and in some ways the most challenging and the most interesting and the most exciting, because these poets were never really, their poems were never collected in such a way, and their voices were never heard. So Nikolai Turoverov, I'll read you from the annotations. He was born into a family of Don Cossacks. He fought in the Russian army in World War I, and then in the White Army against the Bolsheviks. In 1920, he settled in France, where he eventually joined the Foreign Legion and fought against the Nazis. He published 5 well-reviewed books of poetry in France. And on the other side, I'll read you the other annotation. When Germany attacked Russia, many émigrés had hoped that communist Russia would be defeated. So actually, the émigrés were divided into 2 groups, the defeatists and the defenders. So the defenders felt that Russia must be defended. Doesn't matter who's at the helm, doesn't matter, as long as it's there, as long as it exists, we defend it with what we have against any attacker. And then there was another group, smaller, much smaller, who were known as the defeatists. And they believed that the government is so corrupt and there's such awful things going on that anything would be better. And therefore, any attacker of Russia, which is Soviet Russia now, should be supported. So there's also a lot of propaganda in Germany, Nazi Germany, that once the Nazis take over Russia, they're going to make sure that it gets back to its original glory, and that everyone gets their rights back, and et cetera, et cetera. So Turoverov, fooled neither by the false promises, because of course they were false, as we now know, nor by Hitler's early successes. Don't forget, the poem is written in 1942, right? Nazi Germany is still doing pretty well. turned to Russian history with its many enemy invasions to predict what would happen to the invaders in the end. The poem is called 1942, written in 1942, and this is what it is. Hunger and fire don't scare you. You've lived through it all before. Do these new invading Tatars think they will win this war? Oh, how many raiders you fought, and each battle took its toll. But you'd open your dark, wild expanses and swallow the enemy whole. You summoned them, vicious she-wolf, and they came like trusting dogs. You're the same, you'll never change. It's the same as it always was. So, could I have the next slide, please? So now we move on to the third section, Remembering the War. And this is the longest poem that I'm going to share with you. But it's rich, you know, it's richly worth it. It's richly worth it. It's written by Arkady Steinberg, who was an artist and a poet. And his fate is very unusual. When he started out as a poet, his poetry had amazing reviews. It was praised by both Mandelstam and Mayakovsky. How's that for a pairing? And but then his poetry was somehow criticized, and he couldn't publish his poems. And then he worked as a translator. He was arrested in 1937 in the purges. And when his sentence was overturned, he enlisted in 1941 and he served with distinction until 1944, when he was arrested again. That arrest happened because there was some sort of a denunciation. He was accused of anti-Soviet behavior, of spying, of God knows what. He was sent to Lvov from Bucharest under guard by foot, and he was in a Lvov transit jail on V-Day. After a 3-year investigation, he was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in the Gulag. So this is him remembering what it was like experiencing V-Day in jail in Lvov. He's writing it in 1965, which is historically the period known as the thaw. Although it's pretty much, by 1965, it was pretty much, we're into the Brezhnev era already. But this is his poem about what it was like then. I celebrated V-Day down in Lvov. By then, I knew jails inside out. But that day felt like my first one inside a transfer jail locked up. It was a regular day. We got pea soup and magara, a poor man's gruel. We did all right, then it was night, and lights out after roll call. We laid ourselves down in our jackets and covered up with our heads to a man. All but the German major, like some guard, he set himself beside the piss can. He knew that victors are not judged. Ours was the glory, we were tops. His side just lost. Until he died, he'd smell the piss and get worse jobs. A European, he was now a nothing. He knew that come tomorrow, we lowly Asians would treat him like a dog and throw him our leftovers. That is the law both in and out of jail. He understood, he knew the score, so he adjusted to his role at once and didn't wring his hands in sorrow. We neither knew nor understood the good and evil hands dealt out by fate. We tossed all night on our bedboards. Only a miracle could set us straight. We couldn't sleep. How could we sleep, so angry, so ashamed, in such disgrace, as we went through the endless list of all the grievances we faced? And we were sickened by our flesh, disgusted like some strangers, by the carrion stench of our own palms and our emaciation. The dirty stubble on our sunken cheeks gone gray before its time, while the eternal and all-seeing eye was looking through the peephole. Quite a poem, eh? Okay, so could I have the last slide, please? Thank you. So this is Drunina. Yulia Drunina is probably one of the most famous poets, but certainly one of the most beloved women poets to come out of the war. She was, and again, I'm reading from the annotations, she was a frontline poet who became famous after the war. And she had difficulties accepting the harshness and soulless of post-Soviet society of the 90s. The death of her husband was also a terrible blow. She committed suicide in 1991, writing in her suicide note about the impossibility of living in this horrible backbiting world made for pushy dealers. Another thing that we really must realize as we're reading this is that poets were not allowed after the war to talk about war trauma officially. So the post-war trauma of combat soldiers and civilians on the home front was barely acknowledged in the post-war years. The state wanted its citizens to stop dwelling on the horrors of the war and to start rebuilding for the future. The need to rebuild was indeed great, but those traumatized by the war were traumatized still further by being silenced. This is a poem she wrote in 1967. I'm still on the same gloomy topic. We're all way over the hill. The girls who fought on the front lines now carry angina pills. And that's much harder, believe me, than to lug a machine gun around. We don't wear our old army greatcoats or the medals we got at the front, but it's always trailing behind us. Latecomers don't have a clue, like a curse, a mirage, or a flag, World War II. So I think this is as good a place as any to finish my presentation. I think that even though we're latecomers, we certainly realize that World War II is still very much a part of the Russian landscape, certainly the Russian poetic landscape. And it will probably be for many, many years to come. Somewhat shockingly to me, given that 75 years passed over victory over Nazi Germany, I'm still first generation after the war. And I can see very, very clearly how we've all been impacted in a very, very real and meaningful way by what happened back then. My children, they're the second generation, they're still quite young. I'm telling them a bit about the war. They'll have some understanding of how their lives were affected. But I think with every generation, it's harder and harder to see, but it's still very much there. The landscape has been changed forever, both of Russian society, Russian culture, Russian poetry. So this is the presentation. Thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I'm very happy to entertain them. Try to answer them as best as I can.
Thank you so very much, Maria. And we have some people who are very good with their virtual applause there. If you see it starting to appear, thank you. Thank you. Some moving and indeed, yes, as you say, rather terrifying poetry that you shared with us there. Let's see if anybody has put something in right. If you want to put a question or a comment in the chat function, just down the bottom of the screen, you're welcome to do that. But if you want to just wave at me, I will try and watch out for you if you want to ask Maria anything or again make a comment. There's a lot of people who can't wave at me because they haven't got they haven't got video. So in that case, if you want to put something in the chat. I'm hunting and not. So, oh, wow! You may have poetized people into contemplation rather than questioning, Maria. That's interesting, isn't it? It's yeah. One thing I suspect it may show is that this is a new topic for a lot of us. Often the topics that we're covering are ones where people have some experience themselves or have something to share or a comment of some knowledge of their own. So it could be that we've all been learning something new. Well, I might do something really brave and unmute everybody and see what happens then. What do you think? I don't even know if I can do that. Can I unmute everybody? No. I have to do it individually. Maybe that's not such a good idea. Have you anything else, Maria, that you would like to share with us if people are appreciating it quietly?
Well, I can talk about why these poems have been excluded really out of post-Soviet anthologies. I think that's something that needs to be mentioned. So during the Soviet era, I don't think we need to really think very hard to understand why poets who were in the Gulag or émigré poets were excluded. I mean, the first anthologies of war poetry came out during the war. There was a huge demand for it. Poetry was really, viewed by the state as almost a weapon. If you were on the front, on the Russian front, you were exposed to it all the time. It's actually very different from what it was in England and in America, and certainly in Canada, in my home country. poetry was, you were bombarded with poetry. There were special war correspondents who were taken to the front, sent to the front to write about what they saw. And poems were very much appreciated. They were published in military newspapers and civil newspapers. They're on the radio. They're performed on, off the stages. They were, there's meetings that soldiers had to go to, political meetings, and they were recited during these political meetings. So poetry was very strictly controlled. What could be included and what could not be included was controlled by the state, and therefore I don't think it's so difficult to understand why so many voices were left out. Now, what's hard to understand is why these voices were left out of post-Soviet anthologies, right? Because there are none of these restrictions. Although I have to say right now that the state, again, is sort of zeroing in on the war as an area to be controlled, and how it's presented is very much something that's interesting to the leaders of the country, let's put it this way. And there are certain things that you can say and that you cannot say about the war. But after the war, after the fall of the Soviet Union, I should say, anthologies were regarded as an offering. They're regarded as if you look at the language in the introduction to wartime anthologies, wartime poetry anthologies, you read, that the editors are talking about, this is the least that we could do. This is the offering to the dead. This is a commemoration of how much we suffered, or this is, a celebration of our victory, amazing victory, and how much losses we had to sustain, or we sustained in order to gain the victory. So once you frame things in such a way, it becomes very uncomfortable. Even, when I was putting together the anthology, I was in correspondence with a very friendly editor of a Russian anthology of war poetry. And he cut off correspondence with me when he realized that I was including all these other voices, émigré poets. Poets who were, there are some poets who were considered, anti-Soviet. There are some poets who were dissidents. There were some poets. So why are these voices all included with the people who fought and who sacrificed so much for the victory? So this is why these voices have been consistently left out. But I think that including them all gives you a very different view, both of the war. It gives you a really multi-angled view of what happened, and to all kinds of people, including people who were, there's one particular poet, Yulia Drunina, who was, he was an artist, he was a poet, he was fighting, and then he was encircled. And so he was taken by the Germans, and then he was freed by the Soviet troops. And he was allowed to go back to the army, and he was fighting. And then it was discovered that while he was imprisoned, while he was taken by the Germans, he had to build roads in these bogs, and it was terrible work, and people died all the time, and it was horrific. And he wrote actually a poem about it. But once the Soviets found out that that's what he did, he was branded a collaborator, and he was put into the Gulag for collaborating with the Nazis. So it gives you an idea, really, of how the war felt to all those people who usually are not given an opportunity to talk about it, certainly not talk about it poetically. And it gives you, what I try to do throughout is to give expression to all these voices of people who saw the war from different angles, so that we as readers could also perceive it from different angles, see it in all its, I guess, horror, but also all the inspiring moments, all the moments of sacrifice, and all the moments of, national glory as well.
Thank you, Maria. We have got some questions coming through, so would you like me to read them for you, and then you can just go from there? Okay. So, sorry, say again.
I'll try to answer them if I can. I'll do my best.
Yeah. Stephanie says, I am first generation post-World War II. What effects do you think this has on family life?
Oh, goodness. Well, I can only speak from my personal experience. Our lives, like my life, has been molded by the war. First, my father was so ill, you know, the last 10 years of his life, I should say that when we immigrated to Canada, my father was not supposed to work physically because he was considered an invalid of World War II, and the damage that his body sustained during the war and his heart and so on and so forth, he shouldn't have worked physically. But we were new immigrants, and so he went to work on a factory and he worked physically, and he collapsed on the factory floor with a hemorrhage. So it was, you know, my life was directly impacted by his illness and by just, you know, how hard it was for him just to live out his life regularly. I mean, and all the choices that my family made. My mother was quite young when the war was happening. She was evacuated to the Urals, and just that impact, that memory of being helpless and being on a train that was bombed, and you know, arriving to a train station and there's blood everywhere, and it turns out that there was a train echelon of kids coming in. They were being evacuated to the Urals, and the train was bombed, and all the kids were dead, and just there was blood everywhere. This trauma persists, and you know, there's a lot of work being done with how trauma goes through the generations. And I think the first generation after the war is impacted most. Like, I can really see it, like the choices that my family. Why are we in Canada, for instance? Why am I talking to you from Canada? The reason is because my mother, when we were immigrating, said, we're going to a country that does not go to war. Or if it goes to war, there's at least no war in its territory, you know? So that's why we're in Canada. So all the choices, I see them very, very clearly. Again, I don't think my kids will see them as clearly, but I know how their lives were impacted and channeled by the war.
Thank you. Ken says, the poems are very moving. How much do you think the rhythms of the originals can be conveyed in translation? I guess that's the topic of an hour or so's discussion, but yeah, what do you think after 5 years of working with it?
So I won't talk about my poems, my translations. I'll talk about other translations that are in the book. We have an award-winning poem, award-winning translation of a poem by Evgeny Tvardovsky, that was translated by Irina Mashinsky and Boris Pasternak. And the kind of attention that they both paid to every line, every word of the original, the sounds of the original, the meaning, of course, all the shades and subtleties of meaning. I think that they've managed to convey it quite brilliantly into English. And I think you do get a very good understanding of what it is in Russian. And of course, I mean, the languages work differently. Sometimes there are certain opportunities that are provided by the English language, and you're very grateful for those when you're translating. Sometimes certain things are lost, certain subtleties are lost, and that's inevitable. But I think that for the most part, a translator who understands the original and wants to convey that into another language will be able to transfer a lot, if not most, of what was in the original.
And is poetry popular in Russia today?
I think so, yes. I think there's always a love for poetry in Russia. And part of it has to do also with how it was presented during the war. The government made sure that during the war, poetry was part of everyone's life. You couldn't escape it if you wanted to. I mean, one of the things that I write in the introduction is that, you know, my father is a young man, very young man. Of course, he's so young on the front. He's just 18, I think, in the photograph that I showed you. He wrote poetry as a very young man. And then he stopped, he grew out of it. But he loved poetry, and that was good, because if he wanted to avoid it, there would be no way to avoid it. It was everywhere. It was on pamphlets. Soldiers were given these, you know, informative pamphlets. Some of them were in verse. So it's really, the government did a lot actually to inculcate poetry into Russian culture, Russian society. And it was interesting that after the war, when they sort of pedaled back and they said, okay, well, you know, the war has been won, thank you very much, and now let's talk about other things. And they tried to restrict poetry, and actually they tried to clamp down on war poets and what they were allowed to say. So it went underground. It went, samizdat actually occurred after the war, because people were used to poetry now and they wanted more good poetry, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to obtain it. So it's still quite popular, I would say.
Okay. David says, are people in Russia aware that the main reason Hitler was defeated was because the Russians did such massive damage to his army? The myth in England is that we won the war on our own.
The Russians see the war, I'd say, a bit differently. There is a huge, not only the Russians, I think all the countries of the former Soviet bloc, it's every family, as I said, every family has stories of how much they sacrificed and how much was sacrificed to win the war. And the war was fought, obviously, a lot of it was fought on Russian territory. And the horror, like the damage to the civilian population, what the civilian population did to in the home front to try and support the war front. The Russians are very much aware, and not only of how much they've done, how much all the Soviet nations did together fighting the war, but it's also something that they are reminded of every year. The government really has done a lot to commemorate the victory, specifically the victory over Nazi Germany. There is St. George's ribbon, this orange and black ribbon that everyone wears prior to May 9th, which is of course the celebration, the day of victory in Russia. And there are also parades. There are also parades where people come out holding photographs of their loved ones who fought in the war. So yeah, I say, Russians are very much aware of how much they did specifically to help vanquish Nazism.
And a linked comment from Kevin, this publication is timely as in Europe we're experiencing a rewriting and distortion of the war against fascism, which ignores the role and sacrifice of the Soviet people in World War II. I have a question from Lucy. Are any of the poets included pacifists?
Are any of them pacifists? Well, certainly, that's an interesting question. Certainly in the second section of the book, there are poets who were émigré poets who were writing about the war, let's say from China, from Harbin, and who were writing about it from a Christian or a religious perspective. There was one particular poet who was born in a Russian Orthodox family, Volgin, actually his name was, but he ended up going into Eastern mysticism, and he really believed that all people are brothers and that we shouldn't fight each other. So he wrote, one of the poems that's included in the anthology is about a Russian soldier and a German soldier who kill each other, and then there's some divine force that comes and revives them somehow, and they realize that they're brothers, and they walk together into the sunset. So yes, there are, I guess that's a pacifist perspective, I would say. So yes, included.
And a question from Stuart. The dissident poet you read out was an émigré. Do the other poets in that section reflect other dissident views of Soviet society, which would be supportive of the Soviet state, but not necessarily of Stalinism?
So both in the second section and the third section of the book, especially the third section, Remembering the War, there are some poems by poets who were very much committed to the Soviet ideal, and who had trouble, who were very much anti-Stalinist, but who had trouble resolving the ideal of the Soviet state and what people were fighting for with what was going on, with the arrests, with even during the war, there was so much repression. There was so much, and I write about it in the essay at the end of the book. During the war, during the siege of Leningrad, which I think we all know about, there were people who were brought across the enemy lines into the city from the Gulag. These were prisoners to face their just investigation, for more investigation. They were confronted by their accusers. So there was still lots of, and people were being moved out of the city, Leningrad, because they had German last names, for instance. And they were in terrible conditions, and a lot of them died. So there were still things that were going on that were very, very wrong. I mean, people were sacrificing so much to fight the enemy, to the common enemy. And things were going on that soldiers actually saw firsthand, right? There were still denunciations. One particular poem, one particular poet in the book, he was a war hero. He was wounded, and his legs were machine guns. So he was in a hospital recovering, and some kind nurse gave him Pravda, just to read, so he's not that bored. And he's reading and he's reading it, and he's adding up the numbers of the Nazi dead, the official numbers. And he said, if that's true, then who are we fighting? There's no one to fight, if the numbers in the Pravda are true. So someone reported him, and he was like with his legs still, can you imagine machine gunned legs? He was imprisoned. He was tortured. He was put into a cell, like a standing cell. He was standing in a pool of his blood. And when the door opened, he just sort of fell out, and the blood came spilling in. There were things that were going on that were still very, very wrong, and people could see that. And they didn't know how to resolve it. So there's this, in the last section of the book, there are a lot of poems by Slutsky, Boris Slutsky, who was one of the really great poets to come out of the war. And, he was very committed to the Soviet cause, but yet he couldn't resolve what was going on and what he had to do during the war. There were tribunals. People were killed for things that they did wrong, but their own side court-martialed them. And we're not talking about thousands, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So, and he was very troubled by that. He was part of those tribunals because he was a law student before the war. So he wrote these poems for the desk drawer. He didn't want them to be published because, he couldn't have his doubts about what was going on made public, but he did need to write about them. So yeah, there are poets, many poets, I think, who are very, very, very committed to the Soviet cause, who were fighting for it, but at the same time who saw that things were very, very wrong and that Stalin was doing horrific things.
Okay, that is, we've got some nice messages for you in the chat, which I will forward to you, Maria. People being very appreciative and saying how educated they feel by stories they didn't know. Have we got anybody who wants to wave at me to say any final anything, or are we drawing to a close? Okay. Well, what we will make sure there's a link on the event page to Smokestack Books. So if you're inspired to go and buy the anthology, which we do hope you are, then there is a link on our webpage. And it's out in a couple of weeks. Is that right, Miriam?
It's out already.
I just got it. Fantastic. Right, that link is live, folks. Go now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about the book. It makes it more real because it's still so recent for me. And I guess that's one of the nice things that was brought about, one of the few nice things that was brought about by COVID, that I got a chance to talk about this with people that I would never have a chance to talk about them otherwise. So thank you so very, very much. And thanks, Lynette. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. No, thanks for but getting up early and getting yourself your coffee early to make sure you were ready to give us a fascinating insight. This series is called Invisible Histories, as you know, and certainly you've given us a whole range of invisibility there, but which you've spent so long in bringing out to the surface. So that's fantastic that's there in that anthology. Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you everybody for joining us and for contributing as usual. Now there's no talk next week, but the week after, Wednesday the 22nd at 2 o'clock, we gather again, and Ruth Cohen is going to be talking to us about Margaret Llewellyn-Davies, whose vision played a crucial part in developing the cooperative women's guilds into a major public voice of working class women. So we're back to the UK, but another fairly hidden history. So we do hope you can join us then. And reminder that this talk has been recorded, and that'll be going up on our YouTube channel shortly. So if you missed the start, or if you want to recommend it to anybody else, and I'll definitely send Andy Croft at Smokestack Books the link so that he can hopefully use it, Maria. It's YouTube www.com/WCM library. And again, my usual reminder that our talks are free, but if you feel able to donate to the library, there is a button on the library website, and we'd be delighted to hear from you that way. So thanks again, and goodbye until the same time in a fortnight. Take care, in solidarity for all at the Working Class Movement Library. Thanks.